Hey there, history fans. Just calling in to give you a little bit of background into 19th century reform. I want to set the scene for you to talk a little bit about how the United States looked right after the Revolution. And we'll start by talking about this place called the Hill. In 1816, the Hill was known as a notorious neighborhood in this quickly growing city of Boston. To the common person, it was known as Mount Whoredom, which already says a lot, right? The Boston Female Society was really turned off by this place. They called it a place inhabited by drunkards, harlots, spendthrifts, and outcasts, all of who were possessed by ardent spirits, retailed without restraint. The men and women spent the Holy Sabbath frolicking, gambling, fighting, and blaspheming, and this behavior was so bad that many of the women of this society didn't even want to talk about it. They said it was too dreadful to be named. Many quotes, right? So the question then is, was this place called the Hill really emblematic of the early US society? And was this society on the brink? Several authors and commentators observed that the society appeared to be alcoholic, violent, and really had this growing amount of poverty. So, with this threat of the mob constantly there as well. And this is because it was a new democracy and largely untested. Nobody quite knew what to do yet. And the cities were rapidly growing. Urbanization was really at its peak here. So, America was industrializing fast, which was growing many of the cities in unplanned ways, and they couldn't necessarily constantly worry about the state of things. They were in this really tumultuous, strange, growing time, right? Some of these folks, though, especially women, religious folk, and urban dwellers, were starting to look around the world and demand change. And so some of the reasons why they were demanding change was, again, mentioning the alcoholism. This was both perceived and actual as an issue. Early American society witnessed increasing alcohol consumption during the early 19th century. Religious reformers especially believed this to be evidence of the personal and moral failings of individuals, so those who were weak would drink. They also believed it was evident of an environment that was negative, shaping people's sort of behavior. So a lot of peer pressure, a lot of bad behavior begetting bad behavior, right? It was also blamed, alcohol was, to be the cause of violence, of domestic disputes, or even just regular social disputes. And people thought that it made others lazy, right? Not showing up to work, for example, and not providing for the family was the cause of excessive alcohol. And this might sound familiar later on when we look to the prohibition movement, so keep that in mind. Besides alcoholism and alcohol, we have violence, which was a really real concern here. We had dueling. Religious and civic officials worked hard to stop these duels, but people really just didn't want to give it up. And duelists ignored and evaded laws that were preventing these things. In fact, the most popular dueling ground in America was in Bladensburg, Maryland. And this was really close to the nation's capital, so even though dueling was banned in Washington, D.C., legislators and other politicians would just take a short carriage ride to Bladensburg where they could have their dueling commence. So people found ways to get around these laws all the time. In addition to dueling, there was lynching. So, given the weak law enforcement of the era, these mobs would gather and lynch. And generally speaking, when we talk about lynching, it is really deemed a racist crime, right? It's meant to keep in that kind of racial power structure. But during this time, it wasn't only African Americans who were being lynched, it was also prisoners who had committed crimes that mobs could not deal with or see as forgivable. And so the mob would then run to prisons, take out the prisoners, and lynch them on their own accord. This happened especially, even more commonly, in the western United States, right? The Wild, Wild West. We have also the threat of the mob, which we kind of mentioned with these lynchings. So one, Matthew Arnold, who's a British critic, social critic, he argued that only a cohesive and intelligent culture could hold the anarchy of the mob at bay. He wasn't sure if the United States had this intelligent culture quite yet. And so mobs were really taking over the ballot box and just society in general. In addition to this mob, we have poverty, right? We mentioned this before. And this really goes along with this mass urbanization that's happening. Historians discuss the discovery of poverty during this era especially. Average Americans could hardly find work for most of the year. 50,000 workers, and these are all men, sat idle in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in 1820 alone. And many workers earned less than $1 per day. So this is even less than what was needed for a subsistent income, right? It was not uncommon for people to die inside of workhouses where they were more like prisoners than workers. Prostitution, as we can recall from the Hill, right, this beginning story in Boston, was a big issue during this time. For the 120,000 residents in New York City, there were 200 brothels. And it wasn't uncommon for small little newsboys to be selling pornography on the street corners during the afternoons. And, with all of this were changes in demography and urbanization. This population in the United States is growing so fast. We have 3.9 million folks in 1790 to 31.5 million in 1880. And 10 to 15% of this population are new immigrants coming from places like Ireland and Germany. And thinking about all of this, we also need to think of how the North is developing different than the South. In the northern cities, we have a lot of this industrialization. We have these railroads kind of coming into the fore. The South is relying a lot more on agriculture, production of cotton, wheat, and other products too. And we'll kind of get more into detail with this and how it factors into slavery and those issues later as well. So keeping that in mind, we also want to look at these reformers that John Green will kind of mention to you in this next lecture. So thinking about it, these reformers are generally middle and upper class Americans and most usually white. They had the economic means, they had the money to obtain that high level of schooling, and it was also afforded them this time to study social issues and try to provide answers. More often than not, these reformers were women. It was thought that women should be men's intellectual equals, for them at least, so middle class women would attend seminaries and academies where science and literature was taught with music, dance, penmanship. And this is an interesting fact, but by 1820, women and men were roughly in equal attendance of higher education. So there were just as many women as there were men in higher education. So this kind of meant that women increasingly began to form societies and reading circles and different things that worked for reform. And so keep this all in mind as we get along to the next section and go ahead and watch John Green's explanation of some of these 19th century reform movements.